This week on World Traveler Cooking, we're going to make Lithuanian Dark Rye bread. Now, this is a wild yeast bread made from rye, so I have rye flour as my primary ingredient here. It's basically going to be rye flour and water. You can add some yeast if you really want, but it's better off to use some wild yeast. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, and also how to reuse your yeast. Bread is super important in Lithuania, as it is in much of the Western world, to the point where there's a lot of social rituals around the process. So we're going to primarily talk about the making of the bread, but we're not really going to talk about the eating of the bread. One key thing to note is that traditionally bread was made in these wooden tubs, and it was more or less a continuous process. And as you'll get to see with rye bread, the dough can be a little sticky, and so when you take the dough out of the tub to put it in the oven, or to put it in the molds and put it in the oven, little bits going to be left behind, and that would seed the next batch with yeast. Of course, today we don't usually do that, so I'm going to go ahead and show you how to reuse the bread itself, or the dough itself, to seed your next batch. Additionally, we'll talk a little bit about different options that you have when you're making it. So I usually go through the whole pre-ferment process, but that leads to a much lighter bread, one that doesn't hold its shape well if you don't use loaf pans. So, with all that in mind, keep in mind, since I'm reusing bread and I am doing a pre-ferment, this is going to take about 3 days. So I'm sure when we come back for the taste test, I'll be wearing a different shirt. Additionally, there are a few different additives you can add. Sometimes you can add some honey, some molasses if you like. I might add some molasses this time, I haven't really decided. Seeds like sesame seeds or caraway or cumin or whatever. A number of other options that you have also. Some people even add a little bit of wheat, because wheat has a gluten that traps air better, and so you'll get a lighter bread than you do with rye. But if you want to do a light bread with rye, just use loaf pans and go through the whole pre-ferment process, and you'll have something that should be very, very nice. So that's actually what I'm going to do today. So let's go ahead and get started. So making the pre-ferment is really simple. I have 120 grams of flour, that's about a cup. I'm going to add to that a cup of water, that's like 250 milliliters or grams of water. Milliliter weighs a gram of water, a milliliter of water weighs a gram. And then to that I'm going to add a little bit of leftover leaven. Now, if you don't have leftover leaven, you can omit this step. Just keep in mind it's going to take a lot longer to get going. So I'm going to mix these together with a spoon. Now, if you don't have leftover leaven from a previous batch, then you want to make sure that you're stirring this with, say, a wooden spoon, something that's much more likely to have achieved a bit of yeast on it, wild yeast. That still doesn't matter so much because the wild yeast is found in the air and everything else, but we're going to mix this together. We're going to form kind of a nice light batter. And then we're just going to wait for this batter to ferment. If you don't have a leaven, you just wait. Eventually wild yeast will start, and by repeated cycles of putting this in the refrigerator, you will eventually get something approximating a sourdough. If you can get your hands on some sourdough starter, that'll dramatically shorten the time for you. So here we have this all stirred, and we'll come back tomorrow, and then we will add more flour and water and make our leaven. This process will take about 3 days. If you don't have a culture to start it with, you can expect this first step to take 3 to 5 days before you're ready to continue. So that's that. See you tomorrow. So it's been some hours, I would say maybe 9 or 10, and with the starting culture you can see this is really frothy. By tomorrow it might not be, but I just wanted to show that to you. That's a sign that the yeast is really active. There may be some other cultures in there also. Since I started with a sourdough culture, it should be lactobacillus as well. I'll have some additional tips in the description in terms of cultivating this. But yeah, tomorrow morning we will make the leaven, which is the next step. So this is the next day. You can see the sudsing the bubbling has subsided a bit. That's okay. You can start things while it's bubbling or not. And if I smell this, it's smelling a bit bread-like. So I'm going to add 2 cups, that's about 280 grams of flour here. And then I'm going to add half a cup, that's like 120 milliliters of water. So here's the water. And then I'm going to stir this. And we'll get something like a very thick batter or a light dough. This is basically the beginning of our dough process. Now this stage is called the leaven, and we'll be back next in about a day. When this leaven has now had a chance to rise quite a bit, we'll take a bit of this off and we will use it to seed our next batch. But we'll be back in a day. So now on this third day, I'm going to add the same amount of flour as I did before and the same amount of water. You can also add some other things at this point. Some people add honey. I'm going to do that today. But of course, traditionally, this is just rye bread and water. Now, so I'm going to add just like a couple tablespoons of honey here. This can be totally eyeballed. And then we're going to mix this together. Now, if I really wanted like nice oblong hand-shaped loaves, I'd probably add a little more flour at this point, just because I started with the pre-ferment. As it is, what you'll get if you don't do this is that your hand-formed loaves will end up looking pretty flat, but they'll be pretty fluffy. So it is kind of, you get this really kind of very liquid dough here. If you want something that's going to hold up better, then you definitely want to add a little more flour. In fact, I think I'm going to add just a little more this time. Baking, they say, is a science or an engineering discipline, so people like to follow recipes exactly. But one thing about this is that if you're working from pre-ferments, every batch is a little different, and you're going to have to learn to improvise a little bit. So you'll see here now I have a dough which is kind of holding together a little better. And so I'm going to start putting some of it in loaf pans, and then I'll probably hand form another part of a loaf. Now if you have a flat loaf, it's not a problem. Just slice it and make fried bread. I'll cover that in another video. But I'm going to stir this a little more and I'll be back. So, with these loaf pans, it's always a good idea to add a little oil in the bottom. Then I'm going to spoon in a bunch of this dough. This is, as you can see, somewhere in between a dough and a batter. And over the next few hours, this is going to rise. And then whatever I don't have in these loaf pans, I will put in sort of a hand-formed loaf on another one. Now if you do have a flat loaf, because usually what happens there is you don't have enough flour to hold shape, rye behaves differently than wheat in this regard, then what you'll end up with is something that's kind of the shape of, I don't know, like an extended ciabatta. And in that case, that's fine. It'll probably be nice and light and fluffy, in which case my recommendation is just slice it up and use it for fried bread, or just otherwise enjoy it. So I'm going to let these sit for a couple of hours, maybe 3, while I also am going to get this small hand-formed loaf set up. So now it's been about 3 hours. You can see these little pores that have developed on the top. That's very typical with rye. Rye doesn't form the same kind of elastic gluten that wheat does, and therefore it doesn't trap air quite as well. Similarly, these loaf pans are now much more full. So I'm actually going to set these all together, and we're going to go ahead and put them in the oven. We're going to start at 175 for Celsius. That's about 350 Fahrenheit. For about half an hour, then we'll turn it down, be 300 Fahrenheit, about 150 Celsius. And then we'll bake for longer. So these will go in the oven, come back when they're out. So these are now out of the oven. You can tell they're done when the crust starts to darken like this. These are probably borderline done. And I'm going to let them cool for a while, and then I will put them in plastic. Once they're mostly cool, I will cut a couple pieces to try. So I'll be back in like half an hour to do that. So there's no real plating to be done, but I am going to just cut a couple of pieces aside. You can see this is just nicely done. It's not borderline done, it's actually nicely done. And I'm going to put this with just a couple pieces of butter on a plate, and we'll do a taste test. And now for the taste test. This is really delicious. The bread is rich, a bit sour, full of flavor, malty. This is really, really good. This has become quickly one of my favorite breads to make. Now, if you find this content interesting, I hope I've earned a like and a subscription from you, and please check out my Patreon page where you can get access to videos sometimes 6 months ahead of when they are released. And if you make bread like this, feel free to share comments about how you do it differently. Anyway, recipe and notes are in the description. Bon appetit. I have one more note to mention here. And this is that sometimes people do add a bit of wheat flour right at the end to make it a little lighter, but this really doesn't need it. It's remarkably light for pure rye bread just because of the effect of the sourdough. So, bon appetit. See you next week.